So I am going to try to answer, I'm going to try here. I'm going to try to answer this question throughout the talk, which is what determines the value of beliefs. And I'm going to propose an answer about 2/3 into the talk. So our beliefs are fundamental to who we are. They impact our decisions. If we think vaccines are safe, we're more likely to get vaccinated. They have social implications. They can bring people together, but can also trigger war and impact our mental health. Negative beliefs can cause stress and anxiety, for example. And the relationship is bidirectional. That is, our decisions, our social state, and our mental state all impact our beliefs. So this raises a fundamental question of how do we arrive at our beliefs? If we understand how people form beliefs, we might be able to alter those beliefs in ways that improves people's actions, their social relations, and their mental health. So the plan for the talk is first to try to answer this question, and then to use the insights from our answers to try to address real world problems related to social media platforms and mental health. Okay, so we're going to start with this first question, but really to answer this first question, we really need to answer another question before that, which is why do people form beliefs? That is, what is the function of a belief? So traditional theory suggests that people form beliefs in order to select actions that will lead them to external rewards, such as food, money, power, mates, and reduce the likelihood of external loss, such as losing money or getting ill. People can observe their outcomes and use those to update their beliefs. They can also update their beliefs by observing outcomes of others and getting secondhand information. However, there are two assumptions that are inherent in this model. The first is that the more accurate your beliefs, the better, because accurate beliefs will lead to greater external rewards. But that's not always the case. There are beliefs that will lead us to great outcomes, regardless of whether they are accurate or not. So for example, if I believe in God, I might be more likely to then join a place of worship, and that will gain us social support. And that is irrelevant of whether my initial belief in God is an accurate or inaccurate belief. Now, the second assumption inherent in this model is that beliefs are tools to achieve external outcomes. But that also is not quite the whole story, because the brain doesn't simply treat beliefs as instruments to achieve external outcomes, but rather as a source of internal outcomes that could be rewarding or punishing in their own right. So for example, it's internally rewarding to believe the future would be bright rather than dark. It's internally rewarding to believe you are right rather than wrong. It's internally rewarding to hold beliefs with certainty. Uncertainty can cause anxiety. And so these kind of beliefs may trigger a neural reward signal that is similar to, or perhaps the same as, that is triggered by external rewards. And if this is true, that means that people will be motivated to take actions, such as search for information, that will enable them to form these internally rewarding beliefs, even when their actions are not going to affect the likelihood of external outcomes. So to test this first simple prediction, we conducted a study. This study was conducted by my former PhD student, Caroline Charpenter, who's just about to start a professor position at the University of Maryland. So the study is analogous to a real-world situation in which you receive an envelope, perhaps containing a decision of a manuscript. And you need to decide whether you want to open the envelope or leave it closed for now. Now, whether you open it or not is not going to change the decision. The manuscript has either been accepted or rejected, but it will alter your belief about that decision at that point in time. So our study wasn't about manuscripts, it was about money. We had blocks of trials in which you could win $1 or win nothing, and blocks of trials in which you could lose nothing or lose $1. And what you had to do is tell us whether you want to open the envelope or not. Now, whether you opened the envelope or not was not going to change the outcomes that we gave you at the end of the study. At the end of the study, we will give you what's in all the envelopes, regardless of whether you decide to open it or not. However, you can open it if you want, and to help you make your decision, we give you a clue about what's likely to be inside the envelope with this pie chart. So this pie chart, for example, says there's an 80% likelihood that we will open the envelope for you. So this is an unusual task because the subjects cannot control the external outcomes, right, the money, but they can control their beliefs about those external outcomes. And the question is, what do they do? So first of all, despite the fact that information here is non-instrumental, that is, you can't use information to gain more reward or lose less, people still wanted to know. So on the y-axis, you see the probability of wanting knowledge, of deciding to open the envelope. And you can see that most of participants are above the 50% line. They want to know. But interestingly, they wanted to know more when the likelihood of good news was greater. So again, on the y-axis is a probability of deciding to open the envelope. On the x-axis is a probability of gain in orange and the probability of loss in purple. So if you follow the orange line, you can see that the more likely it is that you will gain money, the more you want to know. And if you follow the purple line, the more likely you are to lose money, the less you want to know. Now, in all cases, you're above the 50% mark. So you want to know, you want to reduce uncertainty, but you want to know more when you expect the news to create internally rewarding beliefs. And you can also see that the line has a curvature in it. And this curvature is due, and I'll show you the statistics in a minute, to the fact that there's a boost in wanting to know when the uncertainty is greatest. So the uncertainty is greatest at the 0.5 mark, right? When it's 50-50, you don't know what's going to happen. On the edges, the uncertainty is quite low. So we see this from a linear model where we predict participants' choice of whether they want to open the envelope or not from two factors: the likelihood of receiving good news, which we quantify as the expected value of the lottery, and the amount of uncertainty that people are under, which we can quantify as a standard deviation of the lottery. And both of these factors are significant, suggesting that people want to know more when they can reduce uncertainty more and when they can gain more good news. But how do we know that these two mathematical quantities, expected value and standard deviation, actually reflect people's subjective sense of how much uncertainty they're under or how likely it is that they will feel good when they open the envelope? So we have quite a few data points to show this. This is one example. This is a study from my postdoc, Araya Inc. So if you look at the left graph, what this shows us that the higher the expected value of a lottery, the more participants say they expect to feel good when they get information. Each line is a subject. And if you look at the right graph, the greater the standard deviation of a lottery, the more likely participants are to say that they are under high uncertainty. So this suggests that these two quantities, expected value and standard deviations, are a good proxy of how people expect to feel when they get information and how much uncertainty they can reduce. Okay, so people take action to create beliefs that are internally rewarding, they're positive, and they reduce uncertainty. So there are clues in the literature to suggest that the brain uses the same neural architecture and computational code to motivate these actions as it does for external outcomes. So the first clues in this direction came from Borbeck-Martin and Hikosaka in a study where they gave monkeys an opportunity to gain information about upcoming reward. What is the size of an upcoming reward? In this case, it was water. And they also recorded from the monkey's midbrain dopaminergic neurons from the VTA and SN. So these neurons are known to fire above baseline when the monkey gets more reward than it expected, so when it gets more water than expected, and it fires below baseline when the monkey gets less water than it expected. So this is the regular reward prediction errors that Wolfram Schultz has discovered many, many years ago. Nothing new here. But here, what was the interesting part? The same neurons that were coding for reward prediction errors were also firing above baseline when the monkey was told you're about to gain knowledge about how much reward you're going to get. And it fired below baseline when the monkey was told you're about to remain ignorant. So Borbeck-Martin and Hikosaka named these signals information prediction errors, which, similar to reward prediction errors, are coding for how surprising it is that I'm about to gain knowledge, that I can create beliefs. And they suggested that this indicates that the brain treats the opportunity to gain knowledge as it does the opportunity to gain primary rewards, such as food and water. So we see similar signals in humans. However, we see that these signals are modulated by how likely the news is to be good. So the study that I told you about from Caroline was in fact an fMRI study. And there are a few parts about the design that I didn't tell you about yet, which I'm going to tell you about now because it's going to be important for the fMRI analysis. So first of all, in order to tell us on whether they want to open the envelope or not, participants selected between two blue bars. The more blue in the bar, the more likely we are to open the envelope for them. So if you want to open the envelope, all you need to do is simply select the bar with more blue. So in this case, the blue bar says there's about 80% likely that we will open the envelope for you. So let's say you select this bar, then you get a deterministic cue. You either get a green cue, which says, I'm about to open the envelope for you. It's a knowledge cue, or a red cue, which says you're about to remain ignorant, right? And then you just see these XXX. Of course, colors are counterbalanced. So during this time in which you learn on whether you're about to gain information, whether you're about to be able to form beliefs, activity in the same areas as found in the monkey, the VTA and SN, coded for the product of two factors. First, information prediction errors, so similar to the monkeys, which is how surprising it is that I'm about to gain information. That is equal to the likelihood that you believe you're about to get information, which is the amount of blue in the bar, subtracted from 1 if you're told yes, you're about to get knowledge, or subtracted from 0 if you're told no, you're remaining ignorant. That was multiplied by the likelihood of good news, which is coded as the expected value, right? So basically what this signal was saying is how surprising it is I'm about to be able to form positive beliefs. And so this suggests that the brain does use the same neural structures and neural computational principles to code for the opportunity to form internally rewarding beliefs, as it does for the opportunity to gain external rewards, such as water, food, and money. However, the brain also has a system in place to distinguish between external and internal rewards. So for example, again, in studies in monkeys, it's been shown that neurons in the OFC, some of them specifically encode the opportunity to gain external rewards, such as water, and some of them specifically encode the opportunity to gain internal rewards, such as knowledge. Now, this distinction is important because it means that it enables us to prioritize either internal or external outcomes based on the environment that we are in. So for example, if you're thirsty, you're going to prioritize the external rewards. But if all your needs are met, you will then prioritize the internal rewards. So I'm going to talk in a little bit about how and when do we prioritize one or the other. But before that, I'm going to answer a more basic question, which is, if the brain treats the opportunity to gain internal rewards and external rewards similarly, does that mean that people will then be able to trade one for the other? Will they be willing, for example, to pay us in order to create internally rewarding beliefs? And will they be also willing to pay us to avoid punishing beliefs? So we tested this in a couple of studies. This one was conducted by my PhD student, Valentina Villani. In this study, we give participants an endowment, and they can use this endowment to buy stocks in a stock market that we simulate in the lab. And then on every trial, they can see what happens in the stock market. So sometimes the stock market goes up, sometimes it goes down. This gives them an indication of what happened to their own stocks, but they don't know for sure because they only have a few stocks in the stock market. And then we ask them, hey, do you want to know how much you're worth at this point in time? You can't use the knowledge. You're not allowed to sell stock or buy stocks, but if you want to know, you can. But there's a little trick. If you want to know, you're going to have to pay us. And if you don't want to know, you're also going to have to pay us. The more you pay us, the more likely we are to honor your request. If you pay us 0, then it's 50% likely that we tell you how much you're worth at this point in time. So let's say you really want to know and you say, I'll pay you 90p to know. Well, it's probabilistic, but most likely we will show you how much you're worth on this day. Or you say, I don't want to know, I'll pay you 80p not to know. It's probabilistic, but most likely we won't tell you how much you're worth on that day. So what we find is that on about half the trials, participants pay us. And out of those trials that they pay us, about 2/3 of the time they pay us for knowledge, and 1/3 of the time they pay us for ignorance. But of course, the interesting question is, when do they pay for ignorance and when do they pay for knowledge? So what we find is similar to before, is that participants pay for information more when the information is likely to be good news. So what you're looking at here are trials where the market went up. So on the x-axis is how much it went up on this trial versus a trial before. And on the y-axis is willingness to pay, coded positively if people pay for information and negatively if people pay to avoid information, right? So the more the market is going up, the more participants want to pay. They want to get the good news. But when the market is going down, participants don't really pay much for information. On the x-axis now is how much it's going down on this trial versus a trial before. But you can see that they're still paying us a little bit, right? They're not paying us to avoid information, although definitely some subjects do. But on average, they're paying us a little bit to gain information, even in the loss domain, because there's still a value to reduce uncertainty. Okay, so we see that people are willing to trade external for internal rewards. Let's take this a step further. Would people be willing to, what will happen if the two are competing, right? Let's say that one action will lead you to internally rewarding beliefs, but another action will lead you to external rewards. So we conducted a study that created this kind of situation. This study enables participants to bias their beliefs by choosing the evidence that they will sample at the expense of external rewards and at the expense of accuracy. So the way that it works is participants, and this was conducted by my former PhD student, Philip Gasarias, who's now at the Nudge Unit in the UK. So the way that it works is on every trial, participants either visit a phone factory or a TV factory. Phone factories mostly produce phones, but sometimes by mistake produce TVs. TV factories mostly produce TVs, but sometimes by mistake produce phones. What the subject does, it simply looks at the stimuli moving along the conveyor belt, and whenever they feel they know what factory they're in, they simply press a button and tell us whether they think they're in the phone or TV factory. We pay them according to how accurate they are, so they're incentivized for accuracy. However, again, there's a little trick. And the trick is that we tell them that they have a stock in one of these factories. Let's say this person here has stocks in the TV factory. Every time that they happen to visit the TV factory, they get bonus points. Every time they happen to visit the competing factory, the telephone factory, they lose points. Now, they can't control it, right? MATLAB is controlling what factory you're visiting, and whatever you say is not going to affect your bonus points. The best you can do is just give us the most accurate belief that you can. However, of course, people want to believe that they're in the good factory. And so what we find is that participants require less evidence to reach the desirable belief that they're in this case in the TV factory. When they suspect they might be in the bad factory, what they tend to do is they tend to accumulate more information, perhaps in the hope that it will refute the negative belief. So you can see this here. On the y-axis is the amount of evidence that is sampled. It's measured in time, because the more time, the more evidence, as a function of the proportion of stimuli that is consistent with their response. In blue is when they said they're in the rewarding factory, and in red when they said they're in the punishing factory. And the takeaway here is simply that the blue line is below the red line. They require less evidence to reach the conclusion that they are in the good factory. We see the same if we do a psychometric analysis. Here on the y-axis is a proportion of times they've said that they're in the TV factory as a function of the amount of TV that they observed. In blue are subjects for which the TV factory was a rewarding factory, and in red is subjects for which the TV factory was a punishing factory. And the thing to notice here is that the blue line is shifted towards the left. So let's say you see half of your stimulus is TV and half is phone. When TV is rewarding, factory, then about 74% of the time participants say, I'm in the TV factory. But if the TV is a punishing factory, only about 45% of the time they say, I'm in the TV factory. Okay, so there are two potential mechanisms that could lead to this kind of behavior, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is that before I see any evidence at all, I already suspect that I'm probably in the good factory, right? I have a bias in my prior. The other option, which is not mutually exclusive, is that I put more weight on each piece of evidence that is positive over a piece of evidence that's negative. So to tease this apart, we fit the data to a drift diffusion model. The drift diffusion model allows us to estimate different factors in the decision-making process. It assumes that you accumulate evidence toward one or two thresholds, in this case, towards a desirable belief or an undesirable belief. You can start in the middle and start to accumulate evidence until you reach one of the thresholds, at which point you say, okay, this is my belief, I'm in a desirable factory. So you can start in the middle, but also you can start with a bias. Perhaps you start closer to the desirable threshold. If you're starting closer to the desirable threshold, you need less evidence to reach that conclusion. And indeed, we see that people have a bias in their prior. It's significant, but it's very, very, very small. The other thing to look at is whether people put more weight on each piece of desirable than undesirable evidence. And this is captured by the drift rate. And indeed, here we see quite a strong and significant bias in the drift rate towards desirable information. So people put more weight on each piece of desirable than undesirable information, which is why they need less evidence to reach these desirable conclusions. Okay, so people accumulate evidence in such a way that allows them to create positive beliefs, rewarding beliefs, sometimes at the expense of accuracy, sometimes at the expense of external rewards. And the question is, why do they do that? Is it adaptive? Right? So a lot of scholars have suggested that yes, it's adaptive to hold internally rewarding beliefs such as positive illusions, even if they are inaccurate, even if they are biased. So for example, Daniel Dennett has called them a design feature. Eric Bandura has pointed to their increase in self-efficacy. If I'm believe that I'm in a positive state and that I'm likely to achieve my goals, I put in more effort into it and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Shelley Taylor provides evidence for a relationship between these positive beliefs that are sometimes biased and mental and physical health, for which Martin Seligman provides evidence for causation. All these scholars also consider the downside of having beliefs that are inaccurate, right? So for example, if I'm underestimating my risk, I might not take precautionary action and that could lead to negative outcomes. But they say probably on average, the benefits of holding these positive beliefs outweigh the costs. However, a more nuanced view is that whether these kind of beliefs are adaptive depends on the environment that you are in. In a safe environment like you and I are in today, perhaps it's adaptive to hold these positive illusions. They enhance exploration, they enhance motivation. But in environments rife with threat, there could be a really cost to underestimate your risk, for example, or to hold inaccurate beliefs, right? So our view builds on this, but is somewhat different. We suggest that what's adaptive is not the belief itself, not whether you're holding a positive belief or an accurate belief. What is adaptive is that the brain can actually prioritize internal or external rewards dependent on the environment that it is in an adaptive manner using flexible learning mechanisms. Let me explain what I mean. So if we're in a relatively safe environment, then I can prioritize these internal outcomes, even if external outcomes suffer a hit in the short term. However, they may actually also enhance external outcomes in the long term. However, if I'm in a dangerous environment, then I can prioritize these external outcomes, even if internal outcomes will suffer a hit. And the way that I can prioritize one or the other is by changing the way that I seek and accumulate information and use that information to alter my beliefs. So to examine this hypothesis, we conducted a study where we're going to put participants in a threatening environment and we see whether they change the way that they start accumulating evidence. So this study was conducted by my PhD student, Laura Globick. she had two groups of participants. One group was the threat manipulation group. They were told that they would have to give a surprise talk on a surprise topic in front of everyone else. We will rate them, we will judge them, we will videotape them, and we'll put it on YouTube. We also have a control group. The control group are told you're going to have to write an essay, but no one's even going to read this essay. And then the first thing we did is just to check whether the manipulation worked by asking them to rate their stress levels. And indeed, what you can see is in the threat group, stress is increased after the manipulation relative to before, more so than in the control group. Okay, and then we give them the task, the factory task that I showed you before. So let's see what happens. So in the control group on the left here, you can see that we see the same results as before. People require less evidence to reach a desirable than undesirable conclusion. However, this bias is eliminated in the threat group. No change in how much evidence you need to reach a desirable or undesirable conclusion. The same is seen if you look at the drift rate. So for the control group, again, as before, we see a bias in the drift rate towards a desirable belief. But in the threat group, we see no bias, no difference in the drift rate towards undesirable or desirable. So this suggests that indeed people alter the way that they accumulate information, they sample information according to the type of environment they're in. Now, it's important also to remember that the threat that this group is under has nothing to do with phones and TVs, right? So they're under threat, and that is a global signal that changes the way that the agent starts seeking information and using it to alter their beliefs. Okay, so we see that people accumulate evidence differently under threat in a way that could be adaptive, right? And
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you are kind of suggesting that the learning and the seeking the information is affected by the variance of the immediate stimuli. But I think in a very normal, healthy conditions, the context, like foraging situations, the trends of the environment matters, so that in the healthy range of the situations, like you already shown us, the trends of the reward richness going up or going down affects the information processing and the expectation for the rewards or more bit punishing or negative stimuli. And for the much longer terms, sometimes those depressive patients or some people have the depressive tendency shows some other side of the bias, like a more accurate kind of the bias in the belief formations, or even for more negative side of the belief formation. Could you comment on those, the environmental context effects on the belief formation?
Yeah, let me just make sure that I understand everything that you said. So I think the last thing you said is that people with depression may have more accurate beliefs. Is that right?
Yeah, actually it was slightly negatively biased beliefs, right?
Negative reward bias, negative beliefs, yes. And so just to, I'm not sure if that's a question, but just to say, absolutely, they tend to have negative bias, not necessarily more accurate, but rather no bias, either no bias or a negative bias. So even if you don't have a bias, it doesn't mean that your beliefs are more accurate. It just means that your errors are the same on both directions. So they cancel each other out. And what we see with people with mild depression is they tend to have no bias. Again, it doesn't mean more accurate, just no bias. And people with severe depression tend to have the negative bias. So their beliefs tend to be worse than what the evidence suggests. In a totally, different set of studies where we look at belief update, we do indeed find that healthy individuals update their beliefs more in response to unexpected positive and negative information, but people with depression, severe depression, update more in response to negative than positive. and people with mild depression update the same, so no bias.
Yeah.
That's depression. And then you talked about variance versus trend. So, and here, just variance itself, before I talk about the trends, is interesting because we put people under threat, but there's a lot of other things that are happening, right?
Yeah.
First of all, their environment changed, right? So it's interesting to think, what if we put them in a very, very positive environment, right? Would
Yeah.
that then also cause what cause a change? So it's true, we don't know, right? We don't know if it's the real salient change that we caused, or is it a negative salient change, right? So we don't know that. And the other thing that you mentioned is, what about variance versus trends?
Yeah.
So in our case, there is both a change, it's abrupt, right? So we don't like, the question is, if they are under this environment for a very long time, right, will they still show this, or is it just the fact that it changed, right? So we don't know that. However, I mean, it definitely, we do know that trends matter a lot, right? And we also know that people adapt to their environment. So if you put someone in a threatening environment, it's possible that they change immediately the way they accumulate information, but come back a month later and perhaps they don't anymore.
So my question is that you manipulate the variance mostly, but I just want the subject perceive this as a variance or trend. They may interpret those outcomes as the signs of the trend, either going up or going down.
So, because we're not manipulating the stimulus. The stimulus has nothing to do with it, right? It's just
of course
suddenly,
you
yeah. So we
manipulate
both
the
of them, as I say, it's not
immediate outcomes, but human subject, and the other animals automatically calculate those trends. So that I just wonder, subject interpretation of those variance manipulation results in purely variance-related processing or trend-related processing.
Oh, you're saying regardless of the threat manipulation, unrelated to
yes.
I see. I thought you were asking because the threat manipulation in itself is a variance in the environment, right?
But
So you're saying, I see.
I'm suggesting just even if you just manipulate the immediate variance of the outcome for the subject, it can be felt like a trend.
Yes.
Positive.
In this specific, I'm not sure, in this specific study, the trend and variance in the stimulus itself is the same in both groups. They see exactly the same. So the result that I showed cannot be related to anything to the stimulus itself. It has to be related to the change in the environment. However, we have another study in which it's somewhat related, I guess, to what you're asking. In the market study that I showed you before, so the financial market, when it goes up or goes down, the market, and they need to say whether they want information about their stocks. There we see that when there's great change in the environment, people want information more. So I didn't tell you about this. I only told you about the fact that the more positive the change, the more information they want, but also great change results in people wanting more information. And this is especially true when people are under stress. So if you stress people out, these changes in the environment, non-valence related, but just the changes cause people even more to want information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's please stop me if you have more questions. So we're going to summarize this first part. So participants are motivated to seek and use information to form internally rewarding beliefs that increase positive affect and certainty, even at the expense of external rewards. And the brain uses similar neural architecture and computational to code for such opportunity as it does for external rewards. And participants can prioritize internal or external rewards in a seemingly adaptive manner by altering the way they accumulate and use information to form beliefs. So now we're going to go back to our original question. I promised you an answer about 2/3 in, which is, what is the value of belief? So far, we've talked about two types of outcomes of beliefs. We said that outcomes can be external or can be internal. But there's another distinction regarding the outcomes of beliefs, which is they can be dependent on the accuracy of a belief or independent on the accuracy of a belief. So let's kind of zoom into each of these four quadrants. We'll start with the top left one. So some outcomes of beliefs are external and they're independent on whether your belief is true or not. So for example, in some countries, you might be more likely to get a job if you believe in God. That's an external outcome, the job, and it is independent on whether your belief in God is accurate or inaccurate. Some outcomes of belief are external and they are dependent on the accuracy of the belief. And in fact, there's many of those. So for example, if I believe the market is going up, I'm more likely to put money into the stock market, and I will either lose or gain money based on whether my belief was accurate or not. Okay, so it's money, it's external, and it is dependent on my belief. Some outcomes of belief are internal and they're independent of belief accuracy. So for example, I believe I'm about to get a job that I really want. That makes me feel good. That's the internal outcome, and it's independent on whether my belief that I'm going to get the job is true or not true. Some internal outcomes are dependent on the accuracy of the belief. So for example, I believe I'm going to get the job, but then I don't get the job and I'm disappointed. That's an internal outcome, and it is dependent on whether my original belief that I'm going to get the job was true or not true. So our suggestion is that the value of a belief is a summation of the potential rewards and punishments of holding it. Now, in different environments, these different outcomes are going to be different, right? So if you're in a threatening environment or a safe environment, in a liberal environment or a conservative environment, in a religious environment or a secular environment, the outcomes of belief are different. And so if you move from one environment to the other, you may then alter your belief in order to hold the belief with the most optimal outcomes. And I found this thing on Twitter a few weeks ago, which I think really demonstrates this nicely. It's kind of more of an anecdote. But what you're looking at here is a survey of UK citizens. And the question was, will Charles make a good king? So up until September, about a third of the citizens said, yes, Charles will make a good king. But in September, within like a day or two after the passing away of the queen and Charles becoming queen, that number doubled. So now 2/3 of the population believe that Charles will make a good king. The evidence has not really changed. What changed is the outcomes of the belief, the internal outcomes, certainly, but perhaps even the external outcomes of believing that your king will be a good one. So that's just a little anecdote. But what we would like to do now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use this framework that I just talked about to try to see if it helps us understand real world problems. And the first problem that I'm going to talk about is a problem of misinformation on social media platforms. So we all know that misinformation on social media platforms is a huge problem. And in a recent op-ed, I highlighted that this problem is related to the fact that the outcomes of sharing your beliefs and even holding your beliefs are dissociated from the accuracy of those beliefs, of the accuracy of that information. So outcomes in social media platforms is how many retweets did I get? How many likes did I get? And those are not necessarily hugely associated with the accuracy of the information. And so if we want to reduce misinformation, we need to change the incentive structure of social media platforms by moving the incentives from here to this box here. Now, any outcomes that are dependent on accuracy will do. We decided to test outcomes by adding just 2 extra buttons to social media platform, adding what we call a trust and distrust button. The reason we chose trust and distrust is just by definition, trust is a belief in the reliability and truth of something. And so the idea is that if now we have these buttons, people might use those buttons more to discern true from false posts. And if they do that, then people will start sharing more accurate information and less inaccurate information because they will try to obtain these trust carrots and try to avoid the distrust sticks. And if all of this is true, then perhaps people will then have more accurate beliefs. So to test this, my PhD student Laura Globick conducted a study that has 3 stages. The first stage is to simply see whether people will in fact use trust and distrust buttons to discern true from false information more so than other buttons. So we showed participants 100 different posts, 50 were false and 50 were true. Our population was half conservatives and half Republicans. They could press like, dislike, trust, distrust. They could just skip if they wanted to, and they could press as many buttons as they want. So you can dislike and trust a post if you wanted to. Okay, so on the y-axis is discernment. And what we found is that all buttons were used to discern true from false information. So people did use dislike more for inaccurate posts than accurate posts. They did press like more for the accurate posts than the inaccurate posts, but they used distrust and trust buttons much more to discern true from false information. And this was true for the Republicans and for the Democrats. Okay, so people do use the distrust and trust buttons to discern true from false. Now, if we put people in this kind of new environment, will they start posting more accurate information? So now we have a fresh group of subjects. We show them 100 different posts, and all they need to do is decide whether they want to repost or not repost this post, one of 100 posts. After they do that, they get real feedback of other participants. And the difference is that people in different groups can get different types of feedback. So one group of participants only get trust feedback. So let's say they repost and they say, oh, 10 people trusted my post. Some people only get distrust. Some people only get like, some people only get dislike, some people get trust and distrust, some people get like and dislike, and some people get no feedback at all. Now note that the feedback on a specific content cannot change whether you post that content because it comes later, right? But the idea is that you might then realize you're in this environment where carrots and sticks are related to accuracy, and then you can start posting more accurately. So that's the question. Okay, so let's see what happened. On the y-axis is discernment. This time discernment is calculated as a proportion of accurate posts that you decide to post minus the proportion of inaccurate posts. And what you can see is that people who are in the trust-distrust environment are much more likely to post true versus false information. And that was also the case when people only received like, only dislike, only trust, and only distrust. So that makes sense, right? People use trust and distrust button more to discern true from false. And so people then start posting more accurate information. And this was true across different types of content. So we had posts about science, health, environment, politics, society. In all these cases, people in the trust-distrust environment were more likely to post accurately. And it was also true for Republicans and for Democrats. Okay, so the question is, what changes in our decision-making process when we're put in an environment where the incentive structure is dependent on accuracy? Well, let's think about it. So you see this post and you have to decide whether to repost it or not. What do? Well, you start accumulating the evidence. You look at the picture, you look at the text. You might also think about knowledge that you already have. What do I know about this topic? How do I think other people will react? So if we think about it in this way, it's really an evidence accumulation problem. And if it's an evidence accumulation problem, we can again fit it to a drift diffusion model. So let's look back at our drift diffusion model. This time we think about the thresholds as either a good response or a bad response. A good response is posting true information and skipping false information. A bad response is posting false information and skipping true information. Now, if I put you in an environment where carrots and sticks are dependent on accuracy, there's a few things that can happen. One is that you may start being a little bit more conservative. You might need more evidence to reach a decision, right? So you might take more time. And assuming that evidence is more signal than noise, you are then more likely to reach the good response threshold. Another thing that can happen, not mutually exclusive, is that the drift rate alters. That is the weight of evidence that pushes you towards a good response relative to the weight that pushes you towards a bad response can change. You put more weight on evidence that is pushing you towards a good than weight that pushing you towards a bad. We find that the second option is what the data shows. So the drift rate is larger in the trust-distrust environment than the dislike environment, like environment and the baseline environment. So people put more evidence, put more weight on evidence that's pushing them towards a good response than towards a bad response. So therefore, they're making these choices. Okay, so people start posting more accurately. Does that mean that their beliefs become more accurate too? To look at that, we simply ask people at the end of the study to rate all posts on how accurate they think they are. And we plot here the errors that people make. So larger numbers mean that they have more inaccurate beliefs. Smaller numbers mean that they have more accurate beliefs. And you can say that people have the least amount of errors in the trust-distrust environment. So putting people in this kind of environment where incentives are dependent on accuracy creates more accurate beliefs. Okay, so to summarize this part, we showed that when exposed to an environment where the rewards and punishments of holding and sharing beliefs are associated with accuracy, people will put more weight on accurate evidence when forming beliefs, and the process will increase discernment, behavior, and belief accuracy. So the last thing that I want to touch upon is this relationship.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Yes.
So could you explain a little bit more difference between like, dislike, and trust, distrust? What kind of the reward structure, reward feature distinguish those two kinds of the responses? So the like and dislike is quite personal preference, and the trust and distrust is more social, so that the trusted information spreads in the social group, social structure more, or there is some imperative to it. So I just wonder what kind of the different aspects of the reward incentives there for like, dislike responses and trust, distrust responses.
It's interesting. I don't actually think that the difference is social. I think all of these buttons are social. Like if I like something, that
Both
has,
of them are social, I know, but
yeah, I think the difference,
types of social, right?
Yeah. So I think the difference is simply that trust, by definition, is a question of whether you believe that something is reliable, right? Whether it's true, because that's kind of the definition of trust. The definition of like is a preference. So I can certainly click on things that I like, even if they're not true, right? So I think the problem is that at the moment, the buttons that are available on social media platforms are simply not hugely associated with truth. And so people like or dislike stuff. It's unrelated to true information. And so now I want to gain the most likes that I can gain. I want to be most visible. I have no incentive, a very little incentive to post true information. However, if you then add buttons that by definition, I mean, people can use them as they wish, right? It could have not worked. Well, we didn't know if people are actually going to use them in a way that is related to accuracy. But by definition, it is. And it turns out that people do. So when they have the button that says true, they press it more for accurate information.
So
when
to me, the difference is like and dislike can be done by ordinary people, but a trust and dislike is kind of a judgment made by the judge in the court.
But that turns out not to be true. So that's a really important point.
Or a judge or a scientist or something, esteem people do in the society, right?
Yeah, so of course, they can do better. A judge can do better, a scientist can do better, but turns out that the general population can in fact discern on average true from false. And they can do so more than what they're doing so at the moment. So again, this was a question. I mean, we already knew that there were publications that show that people can do this. Just average people can discern true from false, and you don't actually need fact checkers. I mean, of course, fact checkers can do it more. I mean, I agree with you. The judge can do it better. The scientist can do it. The fact checker can do that. But it turns out that your average Joe, if you take enough people, they can do it perfectly. I mean, not perfectly, quite well. And there's publications already showing that. So we knew that it's possible for people to do that. We didn't know if it's going to work, but it turns out that they did, because they used these buttons to discern true from false information in a pretty good way. I mean, it's not perfect, right? I mean, I don't remember what I can go back to the percentages. It wasn't perfect discernment, but they did it quite well. And of course, you add to that motivation, right? So even if I know what is true or not, I may then decide not to press it because I don't like it or whatever. But turns out
I know
you
it's
much better.
Brilliant idea, but to make such kind of judgment like trust and distrust, there has to be some credibility for the person to make that kind of the distinction, and it's not just for anybody. And I don't have to say. I'm not saying it is for the special occupation of people use those buttons, but in terms of the social function of the society, human society, there has to be some kind of the credibility to make good use of those buttons, I think.
But the evidence, that's the data. Look at the data. It's
Yeah,
just
yes,
prolific people.
Yeah.
I mean, look, they're only at point, I don't know what it is, 0.2, right? I mean, they're not at like 90%, right? But but they're more than doubling. They're about, I don't know, in some cases from dislike,
I'm not kind of disagreeing with you.
Yeah. So, and the reason, I mean, it's a good question. You can ask, well, but why should we do that? Why don't use fact checkers, right? And so maybe that's a question that you're asking. What we wanted to do is just not change social media, not bring people, like, it's okay, you can bring people from outside and it can cost you money and it can cost you. We wanted a solution that A, doesn't cost social media platforms anything. B, I didn't show you this, but it doesn't reduce engagement. These new buttons either increase engagement or keep engagement the same, depending on how you measure it and what experiment it is. So we just wanted something where you're using what's already there, right? Social media, it's all about getting positive feedback from the world, right? And so we're just using what's already there without having anyone else come in and just using the regular population as the users. And again, it's not perfect. They're not even reaching 0.2, right? But it is overall reducing the misinformation problem by about half if we look at what happens later. So that's kind of the idea of why to do that.
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that they are very different kinds of the judgment and responses, which belongs to the different types of the influence used in the social groups. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Like and dislike is what do I prefer to be true? It's basically asking you, what do you prefer, right? It's not asking you, right? And trust and distrust is asking you, like, what do you think is true? And you cannot, people didn't have to press anything if they didn't want to. Then the other thing to mention is, this is not a real social media platform, right? So there's all other things that may happen. I mean, we would love to, our next kind of thing that we want to do is try to simulate this in an environment that is as close to real social media platform as possible. Of course, we would love for this to be tested in a real one, but that's beyond our control. But the fact that it works here, it doesn't mean that it's going to work in the real world. But it's something that it's empirical question that has.
No, it can work in the real world, but there has to be some kind of the mechanism to ensure those credibility.
This is where we disagree. Where we disagree.
Okay.
I don't think there has a mechanism, because what this shows it, we didn't give them the feedback. The feedback was from the people. We didn't manipulate feedback, right? This study shows that you don't have to have a mechanism. That's the point of the study. I think the point of the results is We didn't interfere. We didn't do anything. We just gave them, and they did whatever they want. They gave the feedback. They pressed. We didn't decide how many trust and distrust. Right. This was what the actual users clicked. So I think that actually what the study shows is that you don't have a mechanism in place. All you have to do is add those two buttons.
Okay.
And if the real world would work like our experiment,
okay.
then it would reduce it. It won't take it away, obviously, but it can reduce it to an extent that would be worthwhile.
So I think Hiro is telling us that the time
to go on. That's
yeah. I mean, like, you can ask more questions, like have a discussions, but you know, like the time is a little bit like reaching the 1 hour. So I think you will be kind of you know, tired, and also listener will be tired. So can we like move forward?
Okay. So yeah. So let's this is kind of the last bit. It's a relationship to mental health. So, you know, a lot of mental health problems are due to external circumstances, poverty, loss of a loved one, but a lot of mental health problems are actually due to internal beliefs that are dissociated from external circumstances. And yet they're punishing, they cause anxiety, they cause depression. And a lot of these beliefs are actually the result of how we seek out information and how we use those information. And a lot of this process happens online today, right? That's a place where we gain a lot of information and form beliefs about the world. So we thought, well, maybe there's a relationship between the pattern by which people search the web, the information that they consume from their own self-guided searches, and their mental health. And if indeed there's a relationship between these two things, this could be very useful to know, because people engage in information seeking online every day. So there's a constant stream of data that could potentially be used to identify mental health problems, perhaps even early, and to intervene. So for this to happen, we need to do two things. We need to see whether there's a relationship between the two, and we need a way to quantify these elements of web search. Okay, so this was the goal of this study by my PhD student, Chris Kelly. What he did, he asked people to go online and browse the web for 5 days for about 20 minutes each, and then send him their browsing history. He went into the browsing history in all the web pages. He took the text out of those web pages, and then he fed the text into simple algorithms that score how positive the text is, how negative, as well as basic emotions, such as joy, fear, sadness, and so on. The participants also completed a series of questionnaires that measures their mental health, as well as indicated their mood before and after browsing. And now we're going to try to see if there's a relationship between these scores and people's mental health. That is, the information that I consume from self-guided searches, does the valence of that information tell me something about your mental health? First of all, just to say a few words about the algorithm. So there are many algorithms out there that could score for sentiment, for positive and negative valence. So you have machine learning algorithms. You also have bag of words algorithms. A bag of words is simply a few thousand words that have been rated by users on how positive or negative they are. So you take the text and you just compare the words that you have to this library. Well, it turns out that they basically give you the same score. The correlation was like almost 0.9. So whether you use a machine learning approach, such as one that's based on BERT, or if you use a bag of words, it didn't really seem to make a difference. The scores were almost the same. So we used a bag of words approach because A, it was computationally easier on our computers, but also because it allowed us to score basic emotions such as joy, fear, and sadness, which the machine learning at the moment doesn't do very well. And we made sure that the bags of words scores were tightly related to humans' ratings. So we had humans rate some web pages on how positive or negative they are, and indeed there's a correlation between the human perception and the simple bag of words score. Okay. So now we relayed these scores to people psychopathology, and what we found is that people who consume more negative information from these self-guided searches have worse mental health, more psychopathology symptoms. And this was true across the board. It was like a general fingerprint of mental health rather than related to a specific condition. So on the left is the result of our first experiment, and now the replication as well. We also found using another analysis that fear in particular was related to mental health. So people who consumed more information from self-guided searches that had more fear words in them reported worse mental health. So the obvious question is, what is preceding what? Is it that problems with mental health will then lead us to search for negative information, and or that negative information that we consume then leads to worse mental health? That if I happen to have a pattern of information seeking that makes me consume more negative information, would that then lead to worse mental health? So to test this, we did a few things. The first thing we did is simply ask people to rate their mood before and after browsing. We found that participants who had worse mood before they started browsing were more likely to browse negative information. But also, after browsing, people who browsed more negative information had worse mood, controlling for their mood before. So this is a first indication that the relationship between information seeking and mood is bidirectional. My mood impacts my information seeking impacts my mood. But still, this is correlational, not causation. This is replication. And so we also want to test for causation. So what we did is we manipulated the web pages that people consumed. We gave them either negative web pages or neutral web pages. And we found, unsurprisingly, that people who consume more negative pages reported worse mood after consumption relative to before. That's the red violin, and not so for the control condition. So now we have two groups of participants. One has worse mood than the other. So now we said, go online and search for whatever you want. And we found that those individuals that had worse mood, the group with worse mood, then consumed more negative information. You might say, well, maybe that's just that we primed them on specific topics, so they search more on those topics. That wasn't the case. We did an analysis of content analysis, and it wasn't the case. That didn't explain the results. So this suggests that there is indeed this bidirectional relationship between mental health and information seeking, which could be used in the future, both for perhaps detection and also for intervention. So we're working on these two tools at the moment. Okay, so to summarize, the suggestion is that the value of a belief is a function of its outcomes. Those outcomes can be external, internal, as well as dependent or independent on accuracy. In different environments, the outcomes will be different. So you might change your beliefs when moving from one environment to the other to hold the belief with the optimal outcomes. And you can do that by changing the way that you search for information, which in itself is related to people's mental health. And if we want to change people's beliefs, we can do that by changing the incentive structure of the environment. And just to acknowledge the funding, most of the work is funded by the Wellcome Trust and the students who did the work, as well as our collaborators. So thank you.